While most Americans are familiar with the contemporary zombie as it is depicted in horror films, on television, or even in video games, most don't realize that this monster can be traced back to George Romero and the Image 10's 1968 cult film Night of the Living Dead. Given the film's low budget and limited theatric release, initially few gave the film much attention at all. However, as time passed, it increasingly garnered notoriety for its artistic and intellectual vision, and eventually, in media, popular culture, and America's collective imagination, it would prove to take on a life of its own. Though the contemporary popular representation of zombies as a mob of reanimated corpses who mindlessly stalk the living can be traced back to Romero's 1968 depiction, this was by no means the zombie's original formulation. Interestingly as well, Night of the Living Dead's version of the undead were initially not referred to as zombies at all. It wasn't until well after the film's release that the film's so-called ghouls were recast with the moniker of zombie, not by Romero, but by film critics. This Americanized zombie with which we are now familiar is in fact derivative of the zombie of Haitian Vodou or voodoo, first introduced to American readers in 1929 after the publication of William Seabrook's travelogue titled The Magic Island. Or alternately, as Sarah Juliet Loro describes it in her book Zombie Theory, A Reader, the zombie was first brought to Hollywood's attention as a direct result of the neo-colonial occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934, whereafter the figure was reshaped and rebranded with the mark of a new society's concerns. Delineating further upon such early theatric depictions of the zombie in Hollywood, Ian Olney writes in his book Zombie Cinema that most early zombie films emphatically foreground the zombie's Afro-Caribbean origins. Typically set in the colonial West Indies, they revolve around the use of black magic to raise the dead and control the living, explicitly framing the zombie as a raced horror monster. And indeed, in this early era of zombie films, beginning in 1932 with the theatric release of White Zombies, and in its later iterations such as I Walked with a Zombie, released in 1943, the films take place in the Caribbean, and their version of zombies more closely resemble those of Haitian folklore. Namely, that the zombies are the dead reanimated, but this is done by a single person in a position of power that uses a mysterious form of magic to raise the dead. This then induces the zombies to be easily manipulated and exploited by them for labor or other nefarious purposes. In Night of the Living Dead, on the other hand, the film's setting and the zombies' origins and characteristics have no overt ties to Haitian folklore. Furthermore, Romero inverts the original formulation. No longer are the zombies servile, nor are they under the spell of someone who wants to exploit them. Instead, the zombies of Night are threatening and rebellious. Their reanimation does not happen on account of some evil manipulation, and it occurs en masse. Additionally, he inverts the racial roles of the story's key characters, namely the race of the protagonist and the zombies themselves. Though race is never explicitly talked about in the film, the racial implications of Night are in fact one of the film's most frequently discussed themes and enduring features. With Ben, played by Duane Jones, as the film's hero and only African American, it is difficult not to see his race as a significant part of the film. In his book, Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan, Robin Wood makes this case. He states about the film that it has often been praised for never making an issue of its black hero's color. Yet it is not true that his color is arbitrary and without meaning. Romero uses it to signify his difference from the other characters, to set him apart from their norms. He alone has no ties, he remains unconnected to any of the others, and we learn nothing of his family or background. And indeed, Wood's observations about Ben are true. He stands out from others in the house and the film as a whole, not only because he is the implied protagonist, but also because he is visibly the only black character. While it's true that George Romero always denied that race played a role in the casting of Duane Jones, such as in a 1972 interview when he remarked on the subject, "We had no preconceived notion as to the role being a black role. Duane came in, he looked right, He read well, so we used him. We never took any further note of it. And indeed, it may have been the case that Romero didn't envision the protagonist as black necessarily, but it does not mean that Romero was ignorant of the choice he did make, nor does it mean he didn't take stock of its implications. With regard to race, critics have often noted that Night was made during the civil rights movement, and that this was definitive to the character conflicts and the larger tension within the film. And this is a perfectly valid baseline assessment. However, it is also worth noting that Night was shot between June and December of 1967, an intensely tumultuous period with regard to race relations in the United States. Racial injustices and economic marginalization had long been festering among African Americans, and in the summer of 1967, especially among blacks living in the most segregated and marginalized communities in the urban North, the charged resentment over racial injustices had reached a tipping point. In Aaron Pinnock's article titled Night of the Living Dead Dissects the News, Race, the 1967 Riots, and Dead Neighbors, Pinnock notes that Romero and the Image 10 began filming in June and July of 1967, the same months that riots were occurring in 164 U.S. cities as African Americans expressed their anger en masse against police brutality. Additionally, he provides ample evidence to illustrate the ways in which the news media vilified African Americans and offered reports that were often complicit in, if not enabling, of indiscriminate violence aimed at black Americans. Ultimately, Pinnock argues that Romero and his team were well aware of this, and that the film's diegetic newscasts and Ben's death at the end were in fact a damning critique of American news media's culpability and inadequacy as an institution. Undoubtedly, this theme is central to the final moments of the film when Ben is shot by the white posse.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes.
Immediately afterwards, the film transitions to a sequence of panning shots, each with their own photographic stills. The photographs immediately register as the same kind of grainy prints one might encounter in a daily newspaper. Additionally, by shifting cinematic modalities here, it induces a shift in one's own psychologic and emotional receptivity to what's being observed. As you watch each moment progress, as the ununiformed policemen use meat hooks to carry Ben's body outside and add him to the pile of corpses they've already amassed, they command your attention. The fragmented remains of the story are like haunted memories. Yet simultaneously, you can hear in the background the action of the scene, still audibly fluid. The sounds of men talking, a helicopter flying nearby, all of which is punctuated by densely echoing sounds of distortion. These violent images and the sounds accompanying them evince a real sense of the horrors of war.
Hey, Randy, light these torches over here.
And it's true, after all, that America at this time was waging two wars, both of them violent and unjust. One, a violent military campaign, well beyond earshot on the other side of the planet in Vietnam, the other at home, waged against its own citizens, both against people who simply wanted a right to exist with dignity and self-agency. All of America was witness to these events, if not in person, then mediated through television or in print, yet the horrors all too often were rendered impersonal. Night of the Living Dead, despite the limitations of it being a spectacle by nature, seems to have captured something essential about the psychological and physical turmoil of an era, whether by design or sheerly by an intuition for the craft. With all of that said, there's a certain postmodern circularity and ugly irony to the fact that the zombie has become a commodified symbol in its own right, another thing for the merchants of capitalism to exploit and the masses to consume. For this is the very reality scholars often cite as central to the film's criticism. Additionally, one cannot help but feel culpable when confronted with such a specter. But if there's something we can learn from this film, maybe it is that this is not where our aspirations should reside, and that active intellectual engagement with the media we take in and what we choose to consume is essential to moving beyond the stupor a consumerist culture renders within us. However you want to interpret Night of the Living Dead and the so-called zombie culture that has emerged from it, one thing is certain. This film is riddled with weighty symbols and a history that continues to haunt us. Of course, these matters are not simple to resolve, but until we figure out a way to reorient ourselves in the face of such challenges, it seems quite possible they will eventually consume us.